Hello everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to be seeing some more of these basic concepts that we have to learn before we actually go full-blown into authoring mode in Adobe CC. Some of them might be familiar from other programs, as I stated in our previous lecture, and some of them might be brand new. So let's get started. First and foremost, I am going to create me just like we did in the past lecture. We're going to create a new canvas, and I'm going to create that canvas with a standard size so that it fits perfectly within our screen, and that's just 640 by 480. So it's a rather small canvas that we're going to be working on. 30 FPS works just fine, and remember, I am working on the character animation presets. Now, I don't have to use the character animation presets. I can enter whatever values I want, as I stated last week. So if your goal is to create an app, or you're prototyping something for a website or for an animation, then you can change the settings here under details. And you can also change the target platform that you're going for, whether it is ActionScript, which is the default, or if you're going for HTML5. Like I said, or WebGL, there are many formats based on whatever you're choosing. Like I said last week, remember ActionScript is just the base platform, but it doesn't mean that you need to code anything. So if you want to create straight on animation, then ActionScript would be your go-to to start. But if you want to eventually change whatever you're creating with into, say, a web animation, or you want to change it to an HTML5 document, it's a very simple process, as long as you do not have any code or coded control within your movie clip, within your actual program, what you're creating. If you do so, if you foresee that you're going to have interactivity in your program, then you need to define from the very beginning what your target is in order to avoid having to do a lot of work post-production and making sure that everything targets, that you have all the goals targeted from the get-go. So with this done, let's just go ahead and click Create. And it's just going to give us our stage. Remember, that's the name of this area, and this over here is the pasteboard. And remember, that stage is married to this timeline below. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about in detail about the stage and the pasteboard and the timeline is what we started talking about last week, which is the concept of how timeline works, and that by default, when you create a new document, the document will have a default layer, meaning you will be seeing one layer. It's called layer 1, and it's an empty layer. There's nothing there. This is indicated by this transparent, or this empty little circle down here. That is an empty keyframe. Now, the concept of a keyframe is fairly simple, but it is sometimes difficult to understand for a lot of people who have never worked with animation. In short, a keyframe is a point in time where something happens. Let me repeat that again. A keyframe is a point in time where something happens. What does that mean? Well, say, for example, you're driving a car. You get in the car, you start the car, and nothing is happening. The car's still static. When you press on the gas, the car gets go. You put you engage the gears. You go into drive mode, and you press the gas. When you press the gas, the car starts moving. When you let go of the gas, the car starts slowing down until eventually it stops. The events that made the car move, if we're going to go little by little in detail, would be the steps that it took for you to turn on your car. You probably had to have your fob or your key if you have one of those cars. You twist the starter, that's another keyframe. Then the car starts, that's another keyframe. The engine starts. Then you move your gear, that's another keyframe. Then you press the gas. But in the simplest form, you're pressing the gas to go, and you're letting go of the gas to stop. That means that when you press the gas, that's a keyframe, and the car starts moving. So the point in time where something happened was when you press the gas. That's one keyframe. When you let go of the gas, that's a second keyframe. And then when the car comes to a stop, that's a third keyframe. So those would be roughly the actions on that specific motion, let's call it, or within that particular scene. So for everything, for any change that you're going to affect within an object that you import or create within Adobe Animate, you need to have a keyframe in order for it to start to happen. When those points happen, that's what we call a keyframe. Everything in between keyframes is called a tween frame. So the motion area where things are happening as they're happening is called a tween. So keyframes and tween frames are the basis of the timeline. Every time I want to make a change, I need to have a new keyframe for whatever value I'm working with. So whether I'm changing position, rotation, scale, transparency, basically anything that I'm changing, any of the properties of the layers that I want to affect, I would need to create keyframes. You can create empty keyframes to sort of break apart layers. So if you have artwork that is happening here, and let's say downstream, you're going to have another action or something that happens, you would have another keyframe. Say that was the last thing you want for that particular layer to happen, then you would break it apart with an empty keyframe. You would add an empty keyframe. Now, to add keyframes onto the stage is fairly easy. You can either use shortcuts, which is my preference, but a lot of people were not using the shortcuts. So what the Adobe team did is they went ahead and actually brought a lot of the things that are down in the drop-down menus into this little menu down here, which affects directly your timeline, which is great. I love the fact that they added this here. So say, for example, I wanted to add another keyframe at the 1 second mark, meaning at the 30 frames. So if I go and click to select that specific frame, I can click on this drop down and long press it to see what options I have, whether I want to input a keyframe, a blank frame, a frame, and so on. So if you wanted to have another blank frame, you would just click on that one, and you'll notice that now this empty frame that was the original frame, it covers pretty much everything from here all the way to frame 29, and then we have another frame right there that is the new frame that we just added. Okay, so let me undo that by pressing Command-Z on the Mac or Control-Z on the PC, and that will undo that specific frame. Now, what if you wanted to make a copy of this specific frame? If you wanted to, say, for example, you had something here and you wanted to make a copy, you can just go ahead and go under Edit, copy it, or actually right-click is probably easier. You would just go ahead and copy frames, and then place the frame. Let's say, for example, I would copy frames. You notice that all of them have shortcuts. Click on that frame to select it, let go of the mouse, right-click on the frame, and say Paste Frames. And you'll notice that basically you just made a copy of that frame over here. Now, that frame didn't have anything on it, so therefore it's an empty frame that we just copied. But if that frame had something in it, that would have been copied onto frame 30. The shortcut to make a copy of the last frame that you have on a timeline, meaning whatever the last frame upstream, and upstream means anything that's moving to the left. So if you want to make a copy of that last keyframe, you just press the F6 key on your keyboard. Under your function keys, press the F6 key, and that will give you a copy of the last frame. For empty keyframes, so just to extend a keyframe, to extend tween frames, tween space, let's say, for example, I want to extend this frame from 30 all the way so that that frame occupies all that space to frame 60. I'll go to frame 60, and then I'll press F5 on my keyboard, and that creates frames. These are tween frames. They are not keyframes. Keyframes are indicated by the little circle. These are empty keyframes. When you have a full keyframe, when you have a little circle that is full, meaning it's completely filled with usually black, that means that you have something on the stage on that particular frame, and that would be F6 to make a copy of that particular frame. So let me undo a couple of steps so that I go back to where we were. And let me go ahead and explain what that is, basically what we can do with these things, with the connection between these two things. So first things first, before I move on into actually creating things, let me explain the way drawing geometry works in Adobe CC. Adobe Animate CC. It's slightly different than it is in Illustrator. Very similar. So there's a lot of the same tools, as you probably have gathered by looking at the tools right now. There's a lot of steps that are basically the same steps, and for the most part, the actual actions of drawing are the same in both pieces of software. The only difference is that Adobe Animate CC has a specific set of drawing modes within the program that allow you to draw in different formats. So what does that mean? Well, say, for example, let me go ahead and expand this to to a two column layout. Let me go ahead and draw by simply going into the pencil tool. So if I select the pencil tool, just by simply selecting the pencil tool, remember, my properties tab shows all of the properties that work for that specific tool. So it is context sensitive. Remember that. So I can now go ahead and look at what the properties for that tool are. In this case, it's saying, well, you're drawing with the pencil, therefore you must be drawing lines. That's why stroke is selected. It also tells you, gives you the ability to select the stroke size, so you can slide that up to increase or decrease left and right to increase or decrease the size of the stroke. You can also change the style of the stroke before you even get going. You can change the width of it by changing the format in which your pen or pencil in this case will be drawing. And then you can choose also the way your corners and endpoints of the lines that you're drawing will look like. So all of this is straight out of Illustrator. So you have the exact same thing. So how does it work? Well, pencil is fairly easy. You just can freeform it if you want to, and you'll notice that you just draw a line. However, as you draw, take a look. I am drawing a very organic line, and then it sort of tends to move towards a straighter format of that specific thing. That is pencil options. That is how smooth or how soft you want things to look. You can also change that from here to smooth. So if you go to smooth, you'll notice that it will try to retain as much as the curvature as it can. You can go ink, and that actually keeps it as the smooth as possible. So nothing significantly new here from what you know in Illustrator. To select all of those items and delete them, simply switch to your selection tool, the arrow tool, drag a selection across by clicking up here, dragging across the entire set of items that you want to delete, and just hit the delete key on your keyboard. Now, that is the pencil tool. Now, why am I focusing on this specific set of tools? Well, let's take a look at the rectangle, for example, and you'll notice that you have extra tools underneath it, which means you have, besides the rectangle, you have something called the primitive tools, the rectangle primitive tools, and we'll see what the difference between a rectangle and a primitive rectangle is in just a second. So let's select the rectangle tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to now notice that I have a fill color, which is the inner part of the rectangle, and a stroke, which is the outline. So they are drawn separately. That's one thing that is different in Adobe Animate CC. By default, you will notice that you have something called object drawing mode. And this is similar. It's basically the same format as what you would encounter in an Illustrator drawing. Drawing as an object allows you to draw and maintain whatever geometry you're creating as an object. And what that means is basically the entire grouping, both stroke and fill, behave as one single object. So what does that mean? Let me go ahead and click and drag to create a rectangle. As I am dragging, I am going to press the Shift key to constrain proportions so that I have a square. As you have probably noticed in other programs, squares are rectangles that have been proportionally maintained. So let me go ahead and draw this way, let go, and now I am going to do the exact same operation. I'm going to make sure that I'm still in the rectangle tool, but this time I am going to deselect the object drawing mode by clicking on it. You'll notice, now I'm going to activate it, So now that it's activated, I am going to click and drag. Now, you'll notice then again, I'm pressing Shift to maintain proportions. Now, the one at the bottom has the object drawing mode activated. The one on the top didn't. So let's see what happens. What's the difference between those two? Let me go back to my selection tool, and if I select the bottom one, you will notice that I have a blue outline around that rectangle. That is what you expect to see in an object when you draw it, a geometric object, when you draw it in Illustrator. That is, you have basically the entire object behaves as a single object. You'll notice that you have access to all of the different properties of that object under the Properties Object menu. You can change things such as the stroke size, and you can change the style of the stroke. So you have options that you can work with. Okay, you can change the fill color and all that. Now let's go ahead and select the rectangle at the top. you'll notice that when I clicked on it, I don't get the blue outline around it, number one. Number two, it seems like only the inner portion of my rectangle got selected, the one that has the little dots, the pattern. Now, let me go ahead and click on the side to see what happens. You'll notice that on clicking on that side, only that side got selected. So let me double click the side. You'll notice that double clicking selected only the stroke. And so what that means is basically the outline and the fill are completely separate. That is, if I click on the inner portion, my fill, and then I click and drag it, I can separate my fill from my outline. They behave as two completely separate objects. This is the default mode for drawing in Adobe Animate CC. Why do they have this setting? Well, if you'll notice, you have a limited amount of tools, which is fine. What they've determined is if you want to create more complex shapes, or if you want to draw things that are a little bit more detailed, then what you can do is play with the combination of objects. So for example, let me go switch to my circle tool. Let me go ahead and draw a circle, and let me draw another circle. Let me draw another circle here. So now when I have these items selected, you notice that when I selected it, I didn't click on the object drawing mode. It wasn't activated. So all of these three circles have been created. Sorry, it was activated. Sorry, let me actually delete them and draw them without that thing activated. Okay, so if I draw that, that's activated. If I select it and deactivate it, then I have the object as an object. I have the object, I'm sorry. Let me go back again to the circle, make sure that that is off, make sure that I have it off. So let me draw on this, and then I'll select the fill, and you'll notice that it's different than those objects that I drew a second ago. So let me go ahead and delete that and move my fill for that one here. With that being the mode still, I'm going to create a couple more, and I'm going to draw their fills outside. I'm going to drag them outside. Then I'm going to select these guys, the outlines, and I'm going to delete them by hitting the delete key on the keyboard. Now, if I wanted to create a complicated set of shapes, what I can go ahead and do is overlap them as so, and you'll notice that they are now touching each other. The difference now is that when I click to select this one, that those fills that were connected, that were superimposed on one another, they become one single fill, which makes your ability to create complicated shapes a lot easier, or intricate shapes. So now I just added that rectangle. When I click on the rectangle, the entire thing becomes one single object. By the same token, because this is almost like Play-Doh, I can go ahead and drag a selection only on a certain area of my shape and hit the delete key, and it's almost like I deleted that specific area. You can also use your eraser tool to erase portions of the object if you want to. So it behaves almost like a draw, like if you were inking something in Photoshop. That's what this reminds me of the most. So you can go ahead and get as detailed as you want within. Instead of trying to create a complicated shape like this one with the pen tool, it's a lot easier to simply do a combination. However, in most cases, we might not want to work this way, or in some cases, we don't want to work this way, so that's why we have that option. So let's recap really quick. Options. We have rectangle tool, and this rectangle tool without the object mode selected. So let me do that again, undo this really quick. I don't have the object mode selected, so if I draw that, I am drawing an actual shape. This is what we call a shape in Animate CC. Now let me go back to the rectangle, click on that to make sure that I'm drawing an object, and now this is object mode. And object mode behaves almost like what you would bring in from Illustrator. As a matter of fact, when you import items from Illustrator, you will be importing them as objects. Now, the third option under these tools is to draw what we call a primitive, and that is the other tool that you see underneath the rectangle or the oval tool. So let's go ahead and click on the primitive tool, the rectangle primitive tool. and click and drag the object. Now you'll notice that the outline between the object rectangle and the primitive rectangle is different in color. Under the object, it's blue. And that is just to indicate that basically this is a group object. What does that mean? Just like in Illustrator, when you draw something, if you double click it, you basically go into that specific drawing. So if I double click on this, you'll notice that I now am inside that drawing object mode. And in here, when I select, you'll notice that both fill and outline are separate. Okay, so basically drawing an object, let me go back all the way to the top by clicking on scene 1. So if I go on the breadcrumbs and click on scene 1, it takes me all the way to the top. An object is basically a group or a grouping of fills and strokes. So once you group them, literally Command G or Control G, that's the shortcut, you are creating an object. Now the objects are just objects, they're just drawings. So we have shapes, which is what we have up here, objects, and primitive objects. Now primitive objects, what they give me is the ability to keep on controlling the rectangle in more detail. So I can go ahead and change things such as the corner radius. So if I go down into my object properties and I go, say for example, to 12, you will notice that I have the ability to control the radius. I can also click and drag on the little handles to get more of a shape of what I want, and this the changes that I make here will be reflected under the rectangle options over here. You also retain all of the other settings that you had from the rectangle. So you have a lot more flexibility into what you can do by default with a primitive than what you can do with an actual object or what you can do with a shape. So those are the three modes in which you can draw objects, geometry, inside Adobe Animate CC. Now, before we go, let me touch on what you can do with these, with the differentiators between an object like this one, a shape like this one, an object, and the primitive. If you want to change the color of a fill within a shape, simply select the shape, the fill that you want to change, and you can go to the object's properties panel, and you can go in and switch from the color picker, or you can enter your own value if you want to select a value, if you want to enter a hex value. So we have options. You can also, pick a color. Same thing with the fill. If I double click on the fill to change the stroke, I can change the color of the stroke. At the same time, I can change its width if I want to. So I have still some control, but remember, they remain as two. They live inside the program as two separate objects. Now, if I put a fill on top of a stroke, and then I remove the fill, I am deleting that stroke. So remember, be careful how if you draw in shape mode, make sure that things are not overlapping, because by accident you might be, if you click and let go but you haven't deselected the fill, then you're okay. But if you deselect it, automatically when you select it back, it cuts whatever area they were superimposed on one another. Okay, so be careful with if you decide to draw in shape mode. Under object mode, if I wanted to change the color of the fill and the stroke, they reside both within one specific panel in my properties tool, not two like this ones, which were separate. And on the third one, same thing under the primitive mode. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. All of these things apply to whether you're doing drawings with the brush tool, the pen tool, the pencil tool, if you're doing things with the shapes or text. Now, if you want to change by choosing a color or inking a color, you have the ability to choose the paint bucket or the ink bottle. These behave the same way that you do in Illustrator. So if you want to use the paint bucket to paint something, simply select the color that you want to change, or you can change it under the properties of that paint bucket. So say, for example, I pick this color or a different color. So you can pick it from here, or you can pick it from by clicking on the swatches under the tools area, which is the exact same way we do in Illustrator or Photoshop. So it works the exact same way. So let's say I want to change it to a lighter blue. Now that I have that bucket selected, I can go ahead and click on a fill area, and you'll notice that the fill changed color. You'll also notice that this one changed, and that is because I had it selected. So you'll notice that I was able to change the color of an object that I did not have selected while I had something else selected. So let me undo that really quick, and let me deselect. Now let's use the bucket tool again, click on that, and you'll notice that this one doesn't change anymore. So you have kind of a bit of flexibility on how you control the colors. We're going to talk a lot more about managing colors within Animate CC in the near future. And the ink color allows you to change the color of the stroke. So if you want to change the color of the stroke, you go and click on the stroke, and that's it. Now, if you click on an object, you can also change that. Okay, so it works for all three of them. Make sure that you know that. So it's one way. It's a kind of a shortcut on how to get access to those things fairly quick, as opposed to having to select the object, for example, and then go into your properties window and changing the color. So you have a bit of a workflow that allows you to speed up your process and allows you to get to what your results are a lot faster. Now, make sure that there's an understanding. The main thing about this lecture is that the drawing modes in Animate are completely different in three modes. So we have shape mode, we have object mode, and we have primitive mode. And they apply to all the shapes, the geometric shapes that we are creating, and they behave somewhat slightly differently. But at the core of them, if you have worked with Illustrator or Photoshop, you should be in good shape on how these things talk to one another. You will also notice that my keyframe is full right now. That's because 3 items are in that specific keyframe. We will be talking more about keyframes in our next video.